Twelfth Night was the one evening of the entire year when England forgot, on purpose, who was actually in charge. A dried bean hidden inside a cake could make a scullery maid a queen for a single evening, and a duke's own household, for reasons buried somewhere in the medieval mists of the old Epiphany feasts, was expected to bow to whoever found it, without a single word of protest. Marchmont House had kept the custom faithfully for 3 generations, the old bean and pea method, rather than the newer fashionable cards London smarter houses had lately adopted. And it was that stubborn, old-fashioned loyalty to tradition that gave Frederick Vale, Duke of Marchmont, exactly the opportunity he needed to do something considerably more reckless than he had ever attempted in his entire disciplined, carefully ordered life. Subscribe to Regency Lullabies and tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from tonight. Prudence Whitlock had been governess to the Duke's young wards for exactly 14 months when the 12th night in question arrived. Engaged the previous autumn after a hunting accident had taken both parents of 8-year-old Master Henry and 6-year-old Miss Cora Vale within the same terrible week, leaving the Duke, their father's younger brother and nearest surviving relation, guardian to 2 grieving children he had, by his own frequent private admission, absolutely no experience whatsoever in comforting. The household Prudence had inherited that autumn had been, in every practical sense, broken. Henry had stopped speaking almost entirely for the first 2 months, retreating into a silence so complete that 3 previous governesses, hired and dismissed in rapid succession before Prudence's arrival, had each declared the boy simply unteachable and quit within a fortnight. Cora, younger and considerably more volatile in her grief, had taken to screaming fits so violent that the housekeeper had once suggested, in a moment of genuine despair, that the child be sent to a distant aunt in Scotland rather than remain in a house that seemed incapable of soothing her. Prudence had done neither of the things every previous governess had attempted. She had not demanded Henry speak, nor scolded Cora for her fits. She had simply sat with them in whatever silence or noise the day brought, day after day, doing nothing more dramatic than being reliably, patiently present. Her first week had been, by any ordinary measure, a complete failure. Henry had sat through every lesson in absolute silence, staring at some fixed point beyond the schoolroom window, while Cora had screamed through 2 entire afternoons over nothing more than the wrong ribbon offered for her hair, a grief with nowhere else to go, finding whatever small excuse presented itself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Adler, had predicted openly that Prudence would last a fortnight at most, the same as her 3 predecessors. Prudence had not argued the prediction. She had simply continued arriving in the nursery each morning at the same hour, offering the same quiet, undemanding presence regardless of whether Henry spoke a single word or Cora's temper held for the entire day, and it was on the 19th day of her employment, not the schedule any textbook on childhood grief would have predicted, that Henry finally asked her, in a small, cracked voice, whether his parents had suffered at the end. Every adult in the household before her had offered the same soft, evasive comfort to that particular question. Assurances that they had passed peacefully, that they had felt no pain at all, well-meant lies constructed to spare a child's feelings that Henry, with the particular sharp instinct grieving children often develop, had recognized immediately as untrue and trusted considerably less for the recognition. "I do not know for certain, Henry," Prudence had told him instead, kneeling to his level in the quiet of the nursery. "Nobody who was not there can honestly tell you that, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to make the question easier to carry. What I can tell you is that they were together, and that a groom who reached the scene within minutes said, 'Your father was speaking your mother's name right up until he could not speak at all,' which tells me, whatever pain there was, it was not loneliness alongside it." Henry had cried then properly, for the first time since the accident, great heaving sobs that Prudence had simply sat beside without trying to hush or soften, and something in the boy had begun slowly, over the weeks that followed, to unclench. "You are the only person in this entire house the children actually trust, Miss Whitlock. the Duke told her, some months later, watching from the nursery doorway as Prudence patiently worked through a spelling lesson with Henry, while Cora built an elaborate, chattering castle of wooden blocks nearby. I confess I do not entirely understand how you have managed what 3 governesses before you could not. I did not manage anything especially clever, Your Grace, Prudence said. I simply stayed and did not ask them to grieve on any particular schedule convenient to the household. Children generally know the difference between an adult who is actually present and one merely performing patience until the clock permits her to leave the room. The Duke had said nothing further that afternoon, though Prudence had noticed, in the months since, a particular quality to his attention whenever their paths crossed in the nursery corridor, a lingering, careful watchfulness she could not quite name, and had trained herself, out of considerable professional caution, not to examine too closely. She had good reason for that caution. Prudence herself had lost both her own parents at 14, an outbreak of typhus that had swept through her father's small parish within a single terrible month, and had spent the 11 years since learning, first as a poor relation shuffled between 2 indifferent aunts, and then as a working governess in 3 separate households, precisely how quickly a woman's usefulness to a family could curdle into something considerably less comfortable the moment any member of that family began looking at her as more than staff. She had watched one previous employer's grown son grow entirely too attentive toward her 2 positions before this one, an attention that had cost her the post entirely, once his mother noticed it, dismissed not for any impropriety on Prudence's own part, but simply for the inconvenience of having attracted notice at all. She had promised herself, arriving at Marchmont House, that she would not make the same mistake twice, that whatever quiet regard she noticed in the Duke's occasional glances would remain entirely unremarked and unreturned, a professional caution rather than a wounded heart, because a governess who lost her position over a Duke's fleeting interest lost considerably more than her wages. She lost, in a household like this one, the 2 children she had come, in 14 months, to love as thoroughly as if they were her own. You have grown very quiet yourself this evening, Miss Whitlock, Frederick had observed once, some months before this particular 12th night, finding her alone in the nursery after the children had gone to bed. I have noticed you retreat rather deliberately whenever I linger longer than strictly necessary in this corridor. I hope I have not made you uncomfortable in my own household. You have not, Your Grace, Prudence had said, with the careful, measured honesty she brought to every difficult conversation. I simply understand my position here rather better than you perhaps intend me to worry about it. A governess who forgets her place tends not to remain a governess for very long, whatever kindness prompts a household's notice of her in the first instance. Frederick had said nothing further that evening, though the careful, wounded understanding in his face had told Prudence he had heard, in that measured answer, precisely the guarded fear beneath it. Frederick Vale was 33 years old, had inherited the dukedom entirely unexpectedly upon his brother's death, and had spent the 14 months since attempting, with visibly limited success, to become the kind of guardian his niece and nephew actually needed rather than the distant dutiful uncle he had originally expected the role to require. He managed the estate's considerable business with the same brisk competence he had always possessed, but he found himself, in the quieter hours of the household, entirely at a loss for how to simply be present the way Prudence Whitlock managed so effortlessly, and had come, across 14 months of watching her work, to depend on her steadiness rather more than he strictly liked to admit even to himself. He had noticed her for considerably longer than he had permitted himself to acknowledge, the particular gentle firmness she brought to Henry's grief, the patient, unhurried humor she used to coax Cora out of her worst fits, the quick, dry wit she occasionally allowed to surface in his own presence when she believed herself unobserved. He had noticed, too, precisely how invisible she remained to everyone else in his household's occasional gatherings, present always to shepherd the children through whatever entertainment had been arranged, never once included in it herself, a fixture of the nursery rather than a guest at any table. Even the children, in their own unguarded way, had noticed something the adults around them took considerably longer to name aloud. Uncle Frederick always finds an excuse to visit the nursery when you are reading to us in the evenings, Miss Whitlock. Cora had observed once, with the blunt, unfiltered honesty of a 6-year-old, entirely unburdened by adult caution. He never used to come nearly so often before you started working here. Henry thinks he likes you rather a great deal. Henry ought to mind his own lessons rather than his uncle's visiting habits, Prudence had replied, keeping her voice carefully light, though she had felt her own composure waver slightly at hearing the observation spoken so plainly by a child. "I do mind my lessons," Henry had said, not looking up from his own slate, "but I am not blind, Miss Whitlock. He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama before. I do not think it is a bad thing. I think it might be rather a nice thing, actually. If you are the sort of uncle's wife who does not send us away to school the moment she is married." Prudence had not known quite how to answer that particular hope, delivered with such quiet, careful vulnerability from a boy who had already lost one set of parents and was plainly, cautiously testing whether he might dare to trust in the possibility of gaining another family without losing this one. She had simply promised him, honestly, that whatever happened between herself and his uncle, she had no intention of ever sending either of them away. A promise she had meant entirely, and had spent the months since quietly, privately hoping she might one day have the chance to keep in a rather more permanent fashion than her current position technically allowed. It was his own mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, arriving from her own dower house for the 12th night festivities, as she did every year, who first gave voice, among the adults at least, to the particular blindness the entire household had settled into regarding Prudence Whitlock's actual place within it. You watch that governess rather more closely than a man watches his children's employee, Frederick, the Dowager observed, over sherry the evening before 12th night itself, her sharp eyes missing considerably less than her son generally credited her with noticing. "I have watched you do it for the better part of an hour, this very evening, and I confess I begin to wonder whether it is the children's welfare or something rather more personal that keeps drawing your attention to that particular corner of the room." Miss Whitlock has done more for Henry and Cora in 14 months than 3 previous governesses, managed in as many attempts combined, Mother, Frederick said, with the particular careful stiffness of a man deflecting a question he had not yet permitted himself to answer honestly. "My attention is entirely a matter of gratitude for their welfare." "Of course it is," the Dowager said, with the dry, knowing amusement of a woman who had raised her son long enough to recognize exactly when he was lying, chiefly to himself. Frederick had spent that entire night, after his mother retired and the house settled into its customary quiet, sitting alone in his study with a single candle burning low, turning the whole uncomfortable conversation over in his mind with considerably more honesty than he had permitted himself in 14 months. He thought of the particular way the nursery corridor felt different, warmer somehow, whenever he knew Prudence Whitlock was somewhere within it. He thought of the fierce, unguarded protectiveness that rose in him whenever he imagined some future household daring to treat her as merely staff, rather than the woman who had rebuilt his entire shattered family from the ground up. He thought, too, of every careful, dutiful reason he had constructed across 14 months for why such feelings ought to remain entirely unexamined. A governess's employer had no business courting his own children's caretaker. Society would find the match beneath the Duke's proper consideration, and found, turning each reason over in the candlelight, that none of them weighed nearly as heavily against the plain, simple fact of what he actually felt as they had seemed to weigh a year before. He did not decide that night precisely what he intended to do about it, but he understood. Blowing out the candle at last in the small hours before 12th night itself, that he had grown considerably too tired of his own careful denial to continue it indefinitely, and that some opportunity, however it presented itself, was going to find him rather less capable of resisting it than 14 months of caution had trained him to expect of himself. The 12th cake arrived from the kitchens that evening in its full traditional grandeur, a towering confection thick with dried fruit and marzipan, decorated. As Marchmont House had insisted for 3 generations, despite London's fashionable households, having largely abandoned the practice in favor of a set of character cards, with a single dried bean and a single dried pea, baked somewhere within its depths, invisible until the cutting, the old, stubborn custom the current dowager's own mother-in-law had first insisted upon, and which every subsequent Duchess of Marchmont had maintained, rather than adopt the newer, tamer fashion. Cards, the dowager had once declared, dismissing the newer practice entirely, are for households too impatient to trust an actual being to do the choosing properly. There is considerably more honesty in a tradition that lets chance decide who rules the evening than in a set of printed characters everyone has already half guessed before the cutting even begins. The custom itself traced back, as the dowager was fond of reminding anyone who would listen, to the old medieval Epiphany feasts, when the 12 days of Christmas closed each year with a single sanctioned evening of deliberate misrule, a lord and lady of the revels, chosen by the barest chance of a hidden bean and pea, granted, for one evening only, the genuine authority to command their betters into whatever foolishness the game spirit demanded. It was a tradition considerably older than any dukedom currently holding a table in England, older than most of the great houses that still, however fashionably, observed some version of it, and the dowager considered it a particular point of family pride that Marchmont House had never once diluted the custom's original teeth by replacing chance with the newer, tamer cards that let a hostess quietly control who received which character before the cutting even began. The whole point of the evening, the dowager was fond of saying, is that nobody, however grand, gets to choose who rules it. That is precisely what makes the bowing worth doing. The household gathered that evening in the great hall, family, senior servants, and the small circle of neighboring gentry invited each year for the occasion. Nearly 40 people assembled around the roaring fire and the long table, set with the evening's modest feast. Henry and Cora, seated near the front in their best clothes, considerably more animated than the household had seen them look at any gathering since their parents' deaths. The first 12th night either child had properly attended since becoming orphans, rather than simply members of a happy family. Frederick had arranged, with the cook's quiet and slightly bemused cooperation, precisely which slice of the great cake would be cut for Prudence Whitlock, a small, deliberate manipulation of an ancient tradition that he told himself, right up until the moment of the cutting itself, he had absolutely no business attempting. Your Grace, the cook, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Pargeter, who had served 3 generations of Marchmont dukes and duchesses, had said, when he first proposed the scheme in the kitchen 2 days before, you understand I have marked the bean slice with a small nick in the icing every year of my service here, so that the family's own portion cannot accidentally go to some visiting stranger who would not understand the honor of it. You are asking me to move that nick, Your Grace, to a governess's plate rather than your mother's, or your own. I am aware precisely what I am asking, Mrs. Pargeter, Frederick had said. I would ask you to trust that I have thought rather carefully about it before troubling you with the request. Mrs. Pargeter had studied him for a long moment, the particular assessing look of a servant who had known a family long enough to read considerably more into a request than the words themselves conveyed, and had finally nodded, once, with the ghost of a knowing smile she did not trouble to fully suppress. As you wish, Your Grace. I confess I have wondered myself, when this household might finally notice what has been standing in its own nursery for over a year. You approve, then, Mrs. Pargeter? Frederick had asked, somewhat surprised at how readily the cook's disapproval had failed to materialize. I have watched Miss Whitlock take her meals in the kitchen every single day for 14 months, Your Grace, rather than in whatever grander arrangement a governess might reasonably expect," Mrs. Pargeter said, kneading the great mass of dried fruit and marzipan into the waiting cake batter with brisk, practiced hands. "She asks after my own daughter's health every time she passes through, remembers the names of every scullery maid in this house, and has never once, in all that time, spoken a single unkind word about a household that has, if I am honest, rather taken her for granted. I do not need 3 generations of family tradition to tell me who deserves to be queen for an evening, Your Grace. I have simply been waiting for someone with the authority to actually arrange it." She had marked the nick in the icing precisely where Frederick indicated, over the slice destined for the quiet corner near the children's table, and had sworn, with visible satisfaction, that not another soul in the kitchen would learn of the arrangement before the cutting itself revealed it. The cutting itself proceeded with all the ceremony 3 generations of tradition demanded, the Dowager herself wielding the great knife with theatrical solemnity, while the assembled household held its collective breath, the game's whole delicious tension resting on the genuine uncertainty of who among them might, for one single evening, find themselves elevated above every rank and title in the room. The great hall itself glittered with the particular warmth of the season, evergreen boughs and holly wound thick along the mantels, the air heavy with the smell of beeswax candles, roasting chestnuts, and the rich, spiced sweetness of the cake itself. And the assembled household watched the Dowager carry the great confection to the head of the table with the particular reverent anticipation reserved for a ritual older than any single family's own memory of it. Lord Pemberton, a jovial neighboring gentleman, with a fondness for the evening's mock ceremony, found the pea first to general good-natured laughter, and was duly crowned King of the Bean, with a paper crown Mrs. Pargeter had folded that very afternoon, gold-painted paper cut, and creased into a shape considerably grander than its actual material deserved, sitting somewhat askew atop his own thinning hair. He accepted the honor with theatrical solemnity, immediately demanding, as his first royal act, that the assembled musicians strike up a country dance rather than wait for the customary later hour, a demand the household's small orchestra obliged with visible good humor. It was Prudence, 3 slices later, seated in her customary quiet corner near the children rather than anywhere close to the family's own table, who bit down on something considerably harder than marzipan and drew from her mouth, to her own visible and immediate horror, a single dried bean. The hall fell entirely silent, 40 pairs of eyes turning toward the governess in her plain, sensible gown, seated in the corner, reserved for household staff rather than honored guests, and Prudence felt her face heat with a mortification considerably sharper than mere embarrassment, the sudden, dreadful certainty that some terrible mistake had occurred, that she had somehow been served a portion never intended for her at all. "There must be some error," Prudence said, half rising from her seat. The paper crown Mrs. Pargeter now approached to offer her held awkwardly between them both. "I am certain this slice was not meant for me. Perhaps it ought to go to one of the honored guests instead. The bean does not make errors." "Miss Whitlock," the Dowager said, and there was something considerably more than mere amusement in her sharp, watching eyes, a genuine, deliberate insistence that brooked no argument at all. "3 generations of this family have honored the tradition's whims without exception, whatever quarter they happen to fall in. You have found the bean fairly, by whatever mechanism chance or Mrs. Pargeter's kitchen arranged it, and I do not intend to be the first Duchess of Marchmont in 3 generations to insult the custom by permitting its result to be overturned, merely because the winner happens to be standing rather closer to the nursery than the drawing-room. If watching an entire household forced to bow to the woman they always overlooked is the reason you love this channel, subscribe to Regency Lullabies now. This reckoning is only just getting started." Prudence had no choice, faced with the Dowager's own considerable authority insisting the tradition be honored, But to accept the paper crown Mrs. Pargeter settled, with visible and unmistakable delight, upon her carefully pinned hair, and to rise, as the custom demanded, to survey her assembled subjects for the remainder of the evening's revels. For one long, suspended moment, standing before the entire hall in her plain governess's gown, with a gaudy paper crown sitting absurdly atop her pinned hair, Prudence felt every one of her 14 months of careful invisibility collapse at once. The fear that this sudden, unwanted attention might somehow undo the fragile professional standing she had built, that the servants who had grown fond of her might now read the crowning as some manner of presumption on her own part, rather than simple chance. She caught, near the servants' end of the hall, the housekeeper Mrs. Adler's expression, and found there not the suspicion she feared, but a small, encouraging nod, and near the kitchen door, Mrs. Pargeter's own face, alight with unmistakable, conspiratorial delight that told Prudence, in that instant, precisely whose hand had truly guided the bean into her slice, though she would not fully understand the shape of that discovery for a while. Yet it was, for the first several minutes, an excruciating novelty. 40 pairs of eyes watching her with an attention she had spent 14 months carefully avoiding, the household's senior servants and its assembled gentry guests alike, waiting to see what a governess elevated, however temporarily, above them all might actually do with the unfamiliar authority she had just been handed. Prudence, recovering her composure with the same steady, unhurried patience she brought to Henry's grief and Cora's tantrums, decided, in the end, that if she was to be queen for a single evening, she would at least be a queen who did something worthwhile with the office. "Your Grace," Prudence said, turning first, with the particular dry composure that had first caught Frederick's private attention months before, toward the Dowager Duchess herself. "As tradition requires a subject's obedience regardless of rank, I believe the custom would have you offer me the evening's first forfeit. I understand Twelfth Night's queen is permitted, by ancient right, to demand whatever small performance she likes." The dowager's eyebrows rose a fraction, equal parts surprise and genuine, delighted respect at being so promptly and correctly challenged by her own manufactured queen. "And what forfeit does your majesty require of an old woman on the knight's own terms? Only a story." "Your Grace," Prudence said, softening the challenge with a warmth that drew a ripple of appreciative laughter from the watching hall, "I understand you were considered the finest dancer in 3 counties in your own girlhood. I should like to hear the tale of your very first 12th night ball, told properly, with all the details society's memoirs never trouble to include." It was, Prudence had calculated correctly, precisely the kind of forfeit the dowager could not possibly refuse without appearing considerably less good-humored than the tradition demanded, and the old woman, laughing despite herself, launched into a story of her own girlhood that had the entire hall, Henry and Cora included, leaning forward with rapt attention within a single minute. The forfeits that followed grew progressively sillier and progressively warmer as the evening wore on, Prudence commanding a stiff neighboring baronet to compose an impromptu ode to the 12th cake itself, requiring the household's normally severe butler to demonstrate the waltz with considerably more enthusiasm than grace, and the entire hall roaring with genuine, unguarded laughter at each fresh absurdity. It was Lady Fenhurst, a rather sharp-tongued neighbor who had, on more than one previous occasion, made pointed remarks within Prudence's own hearing about governesses who forgot their proper station, whom Prudence turned to next, with a small, deliberate smile that only the sharpest observers in the hall might have read as anything beyond simple good humor. "Lady Fenhurst," Prudence said, "as tonight's queen, I understand it falls to me to select a forfeit for each of my subjects in turn, however grand their usual station. I believe I should like you to compliment, quite sincerely, and at some length, the very governess you once described, within my own hearing at last spring's assembly, as rather too familiar with this household's family for her proper place." A ripple of delighted, scandalized laughter moved through the hall, and Lady Fenhurst, cornered by a tradition she could not refuse, without appearing considerably worse humored than the evening demanded, flushed a deep, mortified red before composing herself and delivering, with as much grace as she could manage, a surprisingly generous accounting of Prudence's evident devotion to the Vale children, an admission that cost her considerable pride and earned her, from the assembled guests, rather more genuine respect for the effort than her original remark had ever deserved. "You are considerably more gracious in victory than I expected, Miss Whitlock," Lady Fenhurst murmured afterward, settling back into her seat with the particular relief of a woman who has survived an ordeal rather better than she feared. "I did not do it for victory, Lady Fenhurst," Prudence said mildly. "I merely thought the evening's own rules had given me a rare opportunity to hear you say something kind, and I did not think it wise to waste it." Finally, toward the evening's close, Prudence turned her attention to the two children who had watched the entire proceeding with an animation neither had shown at any gathering since their parents' deaths. "Master Henry, Miss Cora," Prudence said, beckoning the two children forward with the particular gentle authority she used with them every single day, though tonight it carried, for the first time, the added weight of the paper crown still sitting askew on her head. "As queen of this evening's revels, I require a forfeit from you both as well. I should like each of you to tell this entire hall one thing you loved best about your mother and father, so that everyone here tonight might remember them properly, alongside all the silliness we have managed so far." The hall went quiet in an entirely different register than before. The household's assembled guests, understanding immediately the gravity beneath the game's playful surface, and Henry, standing before nearly 40 watching adults with a courage Prudence had spent 14 months carefully building in him, one small day at a time, took a breath and spoke for the first time that evening about his father's habit of reading aloud from adventure novels every single night before bed, doing all the voices badly and entirely without shame, insisting on a full chapter even when the hour grew late and Henry's own eyes had begun to droop. He did the pirate captain's voice worst of all, Henry said, a small, genuine smile breaking through as he spoke, the first the household had seen from him at any formal gathering since the accident. He tried to sound fierce, but he only ever managed to sound like our old vicar with a cold. Mama used to laugh so hard she had to leave the room. Cora, encouraged by her brother's example and tugging at Prudence's sleeve for reassurance before she spoke, described her mother's particular laugh next, the one that always started as a small, undignified snort before the rest of it caught up, a sound Cora attempted to imitate herself, badly, drawing a warm ripple of laughter from the watching hall. She said proper ladies were not supposed to laugh like that. Cora said, but Papa always told her it was his favorite sound in the whole house, snort and all, and that he had married her chiefly for it. The hall, rather than falling into the awkward, grief-stricken silence such memories might once have provoked, laughed warmly and fondly along with the children, and several of the older guests, emboldened by the children's own courage, began offering their own memories of the late Duke and Duchess in turn, a hunting mishap here, a shared joke there, until the whole evening had become, without anyone quite planning it, as much a wake as a celebration, grief and joy sitting comfortably together at the same table, for the first time since the accident that had orphaned them both. Frederick, watching his niece and nephew laugh openly about their parents in front of an entire hall of guests, rather than flinching from the subject, as the household had carefully tiptoed around it for over a year, felt his own throat tighten with an emotion considerably larger than simple gratitude. Frederick, watching from across the hall, found he could not take his eyes from the scene. The woman he had rigged an ancient tradition to elevate, having transformed a single evening's mischief into the first genuine, unguarded happiness his niece and nephew had shown in over a year, it was the Dowager Duchess herself, sharp-eyed as ever, and considerably less inclined toward patience than her son, who forced the matter Frederick had hoped to manage rather more gradually. Watching Mrs. Pargeter clear the last of the cake plates near the evening's end, The dowager beckoned the cook aside with the particular imperious authority 30 years of duchesshood had perfected. "Tell me plainly, Mrs. Pargeter," the dowager said, low enough that only the cook, and by unfortunate proximity, Frederick himself could hear it. "Did the bean truly fall to Miss Whitlock by chance this evening? Or did some hand in this household arrange it rather more deliberately than 3 generations of tradition generally permits?" Mrs. Pargeter, caught between loyalty to her master and a lifetime's habit of honesty, with the dowager she had served since girlhood, hesitated visibly, her eyes flicking, involuntarily, toward Frederick across the hall. "I will not have an innocent woman blamed for whatever arrangement passed between yourself and my son, Mrs. Pargeter," the dowager said, her voice sharpening. "If this evening's whole game was rigged, I would know it plainly, and I would know precisely whose idea it was, before this household's gossip decides Miss Whitlock somehow schemed her own crowning and ruins the very warmth we have all just watched her create." Frederick, understanding immediately that his mother's question threatened to unravel the entire evening's careful magic into exactly the kind of ugly speculation Prudence had spent 14 months of quiet reliability protecting herself from, crossed the hall before Mrs. Pargeter could be forced to answer at all. "It was my doing, Mother, entirely and alone," Frederick said, loudly enough that the nearest cluster of guests turned, curious, toward the sudden shift in the evening's tone. "I asked Mrs. Pargeter to mark Miss Whitlock's slice 2 days ago, and I will not have her or the tradition itself blamed for a decision that was mine and mine only to make. If a man finally choosing to be seen making his own choice, rather than let a servant take the blame for it, is the kind of ending you needed tonight, share this story with someone who loves watching quiet courage. Finally speak plainly." The hall's attention, already primed by an evening of forfeits and unexpected warmth, turned entirely toward the Duke, and Prudence, still wearing her paper crown near the fire, felt her own stomach drop with a fresh, different kind of mortification, the sudden, dreadful understanding that the evening's entire elevation had been engineered rather than accidental, and the accompanying fear that the whole assembled household would now read her crowning as some manner of favoritism rather than the genuine chance she had believed it to be. "Why, Frederick?" the dowager asked, though her sharp eyes had already softened considerably. Understanding, faster than her son himself seemed prepared to admit aloud, precisely what answer was coming. Frederick crossed the remaining distance to where Prudence stood, the paper crown still sitting slightly askew atop her carefully pinned hair, and found, standing before the entire assembled household, with every eye in the hall now fixed upon him, that he no longer had the slightest interest in retreating back into the careful, dutiful distance he had maintained for 14 entire months. "Because I have watched this woman rebuild 2 grieving children from the ground up for over a year, with no thanks beyond her modest wages, and no recognition beyond my own private, entirely inadequate gratitude," Frederick said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. "I have watched her sit in that nursery corner, at every gathering this household has held, present enough to manage the children, and invisible enough that not one guest in this room, myself included, until tonight, thought to wonder what she might contribute to the evening beyond keeping Henry and Cora quiet. I rigged an old family tradition, Mother, because I did not know how else to force this entire room, myself very much included, to finally look at Miss Whitlock the way I have been looking at her, quite helplessly, for rather longer than I have had the courage to admit." The silence that followed lasted the length of several held breaths, the entire hall recalculating, in real time, both the governess in the paper crown and the Duke, who had just dismantled his own careful reticence in front of nearly 40 witnesses. Prudence, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, found her own carefully guarded composure entirely unequal to the moment, though what rose in her, beneath the mortification of being so suddenly and publicly exposed, was not offense at all. "You rigged an entire ancient tradition?" "Your Grace," Prudence said finally, her voice unsteady in a way 14 months of professional composure had never once permitted it to be, merely so that a room full of people might look at me properly for one evening. I rigged it, Frederick said, because I did not trust myself to say plainly, in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, what I have felt watching you rebuild this household for over a year. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that if the whole room were required by ancient custom to treat you as royalty for one single night, I might finally find the courage to treat you as what you actually are to me every other night as well, without the excuse of a bean and a paper crown to hide behind. Henry, watching the exchange with the same careful attention he brought to every important thing in his young life, tugged at Prudence's sleeve. "Does this mean you are not going away, Miss Whitlock? Cora is frightened you will leave now that everyone knows." Prudence knelt, crown and all, to the boy's level, her earlier mortification dissolving entirely into the gentle warmth she brought to every one of their daily lessons. "I am not going anywhere, Henry, whatever happens next between His Grace and myself. I promised you both that a very long time ago, and I do not intend to break it over a dried bean and a paper crown, however much trouble they have apparently caused this evening." The Dowager, watching the entire exchange with an expression that had moved, across the space of a single conversation, from sharp suspicion to something considerably warmer, cleared her throat with the particular deliberate authority of a woman determined to settle a matter before an entire household's gossip could settle it for her instead. "Well," the Dowager said, addressing the hall at large with the brisk finality of 30 years' practice at managing a room, "it appears this household's 12th night tradition has rather outdone itself this year. I confess I have never once, in 3 generations of hosting this particular game, seen the bean prove quite so genuinely prophetic. I do not intend to spend the remainder of this evening pretending otherwise, and I would ask this room to extend Miss Whitlock the same courtesy." She turned to Prudence directly, and, to the audible gasp of several watching guests, sank into a full, formal curtsy before the startled governess, precisely as tradition demanded any subject offer their 12th night queen. "Your Majesty," the Dowager said, with real warmth beneath the theatrical formality, "I believe my son has finally found something considerably more valuable than a title to recommend a woman, and I find myself, for the first time in a great many years, entirely without objection to make about it." One by one, the assembled household followed the Dowager's lead, guests and senior servants alike, offering Prudence the evening's traditional bows and curtsies with a warmth that had, somewhere in the last quarter hour, become entirely genuine rather than merely ceremonial, and Prudence, still wearing her slightly crooked paper crown, found herself, for the first time in 14 months of careful invisibility, thoroughly, undeniably seen. Prudence spent the weeks between 12th night and the spring that followed turning the whole extraordinary evening over in her mind with rather more caution than the household's collective delight might have suggested was necessary. She had watched a duke's attention curdle into inconvenience once before, in a previous household, and she found herself, even amid the Dowager's genuine warmth and the servants' evident approval, unable to entirely set aside the old hard-won fear that some future disagreement or society's own disapproval might yet undo what one magical evening had built. "You are still doing the ledger face, Miss Whitlock," Mrs. Adler, the housekeeper, observed one February afternoon, finding Prudence lost in thought over the children's lesson books rather than actually marking them. "Whatever sum you are struggling to reconcile in that head of yours, I promise you the whole household has already settled the matter, rather more simply than you are currently allowing yourself to believe." "I have been wrong to trust a family's good opinion before, Mrs. Adler," Prudence admitted. "It is difficult to unlearn that particular caution merely because one remarkable evening went considerably better than I had any right to expect. Then judge His Grace by what he does in the ordinary months between remarkable evenings, not merely by the evening itself," Mrs. Adler said, with the plain practical wisdom of a woman who had served this household for 30 years. "He has spent every day since 12th night finding some new excuse to seek your company, Miss Whitlock, in the ordinary daylight of an ordinary Tuesday, rather than merely under the cover of ancient tradition. I have watched a great many passing fancies in service to this family. I have never once watched one sustain itself through quite so many perfectly unremarkable Tuesdays. It was, Prudence thought afterward, precisely the clarity she had needed, and it was with that particular steadiness, watching Frederick's quiet, consistent attention hold steady through the ordinary unremarkable months rather than fade with the season's novelty, that she arrived by early spring at a confidence she had not expected to feel this side of caution ever again. Frederick proposed that spring, in the same nursery corner where Prudence had spent 14 months rebuilding his niece and nephew's shattered world, with Henry and Cora themselves, at Prudence's own insistence, present and thoroughly delighted to witness it. Henry, considerably recovered from the silent, grieving boy Prudence had first met, informed the assembled adults, with great solemnity, that he intended to be groomsman, regardless of whether the custom generally permitted an 8-year-old the honor, and Cora spent the entire proposal attempting, with considerable determination, to fit the framed paper crown onto her own head instead. They were married that June, in the same parish church where Henry and Cora's own parents had once wed, a ceremony considerably larger than the quiet Twelfth Night gathering that had begun it all, though Frederick insisted, over his mother's mild objection, that Mrs. Pargeter herself be seated among the honored guests, rather than confined to the kitchens for the wedding breakfast that followed, a small correction of the household's own hierarchy that the cook accepted with visible, tearful pride. Henry, standing beside his uncle as the small, determined groomsman he had insisted upon becoming, leaned close to Prudence just before the vicar began and reminded her, with the same solemn seriousness he had once used to voice his careful hope in the nursery, that she had promised never to send him or Cora away. "I remember, Henry," Prudence told him, smiling despite the formality of the moment. "I have not forgotten a single word of it, and I do not intend to start forgetting my promises now that I am about to become your aunt as well as your governess." "Good," Henry said, with the simple, satisfied gravity of a boy who has just watched his most careful hope confirmed in front of an entire church full of witnesses, and took his place at his uncle's side, with a lightness in his step that the household had not seen in him since long before the accident that had first orphaned him. Frederick kept the original paper crown, badly creased and considerably worse for wear, after that first eventful Twelfth Night, framed in his own study for the remainder of his life, alongside a small dish holding a single dried bean, and told anyone curious enough to ask about the peculiar pairing that it commemorated, the single evening he had finally found the courage to stop merely watching the most important person in his household, and start, at long last, actually telling her so. If Frederick and Prudence's story reminded you that sometimes it takes one rigged tradition to finally see what was there all along, hit that like button. Share this with someone who has ever quietly held a grieving family together without a single word of thanks, and subscribe to Regency Lullabies so the next story finds you the moment it is ready. Tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven the Duke for rigging the whole tradition, or made him work considerably harder for it first? I will see you in the next story.